I'm David Grosso here for another episode of Follow the Prophet, and I have a very special guest today. You may have heard of him, especially if you're my age. I'm in my actually, I'm almost 40 at this point. But Congressman Dennis Kucinich was someone who was, a flag waver for the progressive movement. He ran for president in 2004, among many other things, and he's really been a person who fights corruption and was ahead of his time, really, politically. He's here joining me to talk about his story. How you doing?
Good to be with you today. It's, you know, like you, a lot of things going on, and I'm very grateful to have the chance to discuss the division of light and power with you in bold.
Yeah, so you have a book where you talk about your experience, but before we get to, how you cleaned up Cleveland, like you grew up in Cleveland. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing and what it was
Well,
like.
I grew up in Cleveland, the oldest of seven. My parents never owned a home. And as the family grew, it became increasingly difficult to find a place to rent. So, you know, we'd go from two children to three, and suddenly it was very difficult to find a place. And often we just try to land with as many kids as we might be able to get into the apartment. The landlord would show up and say, you have to go. By the time I was 17, I lived in about 21 different places, including a couple cars. And that gave me a real compassion for what people can go through in life. You know, as a child, you don't really, it's kind of all an adventure. You don't really think about uh, the trials that your parents go through day to day to day because you're just living in a child's world. But you know, as I look back, it's really a uh, it's really been a blessing because it's informed me from an early time how difficult life can be for people, how people have to struggle to make ends meet, uh, how one must always take that into account when you're in public service. Because and right now these are particularly tough times for people in the Cleveland area. There's a high poverty, high crime, a lot of social disorganization, you know, and it's like I have a great big family here that I'm going to try to take care of.
So you got into politics at the age of 23. You joined the city council. Can you tell me a little bit about what inspired you besides your upbringing? And really, statistically, not a lot of people like you end up in politics.
Well, you know, I've always felt on a spiritual side that my life doesn't belong just to me. It's, you know, I believe in service. If you want to be a leader, you should first be a servant. And so throughout my childhood, it was about serving and helping others. And when I was thinking about a career, I became interested in public service when John Kennedy was president. And I thought, you know, maybe this is an area where I could help people. So I ran for office at age 20 and was elected the next time I ran 2 years later. And I was motivated and still am by a desire to serve, by a desire to help people, by a desire to make government work for people, to meet people's practical aspirations for safety and for good housing and clean streets and you know all those things that matter.
Well, and your first big political fight was with the power company. You wrote a book about it, of course. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience fighting corruption with the public light company?
Well, the minute that I got into council, you know, I won an election. It's Christmas time, just before I take the oath of office. I'm shopping with my wife in downtown Cleveland, and all of a sudden, all the lights go off. Christmas disappears. Now, Cleveland had been having blackouts at inopportune times. We have a public power system. That system has competed door to door with a private utility monopoly in about a third of the city. But the city kept having outages, and I wondered what's going on here. And so when I got into council, I found out that the private power company was blocking the city from making repairs on its generators so we could generate power. And in doing that, it made the city system less reliable. They were basically lobbying the city council to stop our municipal system from working. As the story goes on, I discover that some of the blackouts which the city was experiencing were being engineered by the private power company. That when the city needed a transfer of power, the private power company operated it in such a way as to create a blackout on the Muni Light system. And then they'd send their salesmen into Muni Light areas saying, looks like your company doesn't work too well. Why don't you sign up with us? There's a lot of dirty tricks. And the story is one of corporate sabotage, of corporate espionage. But it's also
Sounds
one
like
about,
something
go ahead.
sounds like something you would hear, Congressman, in like a third world country. Doesn't sound like something that would happen in Ohio.
Well, it did. And you have to keep in mind at that point, Cleveland, Ohio was the number 3 corporate capital in America. And the corporations had decided that they just were going to back their member, the Cleveland Electric Illuminating Company, in its effort to take over Muni Light. And at the same time, Cleveland was the number 3, was the bombing capital of America. Mob factions were at war with each other for control of gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, vices of all kinds. And that, war broke out into the open. And it was against that backdrop that I end up running for mayor on a pledge to save our city's municipal electric system from a takeover. Now, keep in mind, the system had been sold. I intervened. When I intervened, a high-powered rifle shot missed my head by a fraction of an inch. And I didn't realize until I was mayor that there was an active assassination plot, that there was so much at stake with this little utility, that the private utility wanted to eliminate competition, be able to charge whatever they could to all utility customers in the area, and be able to start paying off the debts that were growing for them on nuclear power plants that they had built, which were not being used and which were not useful. And so they had a financial, and there was a point when I became mayor that whatever they could do to get me out of the way, they were prepared to do.
Wow. So how I was going to ask that question, how did you live to tell this tale? Because it seems like with that type of lawlessness and all those entrenched economic interests, they were going to stop you, whatever the cost.
Luck. I mean, absolute luck. I'll give you an example. I was supposed to be the Grand Marshal in a parade on the east side of Cleveland, primarily African American area, around Columbus Day in 1978. And I was waiting to meet with Carl Stokes, who was the first African American elected mayor of a big city, Mayor of Cleveland, in 1967. I was waiting to meet with Carl Stokes, and at that point, Carl was making his name in broadcasting in New York City. So while I was waiting for Carl, I'm upstairs in my library in the very home that I'm talking to you from now. I suddenly passed out, and when I woke up, there was blood everywhere. I didn't know what had happened. I was covered in blood from top to bottom, and I slumped back into the chair. My wife at this point was calling Carl, who had arrived, to come upstairs. He lifts me up out of the bed, out of the chair, puts me in bed, and the ambulance is on its way. It turned out that I had an ulcer that broke over an artery, and I was bleeding to death. And I was rushed to Hillcrest Hospital, where over a period of time I was transfused 6 units, which is like a complete transfusion. When I came to, I saw police everywhere at the hospital, and I talked to the chief of police. I said, "What the heck's going on here?" Well, they told me that they had discovered that there was this plot that was supposed to be executed while I was in that parade. And if I had been in that parade, I may not have lived to tell about it. And so because I was rushed to the hospital instead, I avoided that uh, very dangerous and possibly fatal encounter. I mean, this is one of the things about the book that makes the book, um, for me, it was just extraordinary just to have to write it. But for the reader, you'll find it compelling from the standpoint of how just sometimes fate intervenes. And just so you know, there was a U.S. Senate subcommittee report on organized crime in the Midwest that documented this very event that I'm talking about, which uh, was supposed to occur while I was in this parade. So, yeah, I was absolutely lucky to make it out of that term alive. And there were ongoing plots throughout the remainder of my time in office. So, and I read about those as well, but I never talked
So
about it at the time.
yeah, so in the end, Muni Light saved the city hundreds of millions of dollars and kind of cemented the rest of your political career, which took you to the state senate and ultimately to Congress. What what lessons did you take from that debacle and, living in danger and fighting these entrenched interests to the rest of your career?
Never, never give up and never give in. Muni Light had been sold. I got involved and turned it around, saved the system, stopped the uh, private utility from forcing the sale, stopped a bank that told me on December 15, 1978, they were going to renew the city's credit on loans I hadn't even taken out unless I agreed to sell Munilight to the private utility, which was their banking partner. I said no. They put the city of Cleveland into default. If you believe in something, you take a stand. You don't give up. You don't give in. And to me, public service means that you might be called upon at one point or another to put it all on the line, put your very career on the line. I was. I didn't know, by the way, after I left City Hall in 1979, that I'd ever have a political career again because I was getting smeared as a guy that, quote, bankrupted, unquote, the city of Cleveland. None of that was true, but it didn't matter because people knew what they were told in the newspapers, and the rest of the media at that time in Cleveland, they were all in the tank for the private utility company and for the bank. They're all going along with this idea of selling Muni Light. The city was gaslighted. I mean, the story is a psychological thriller as well because it shows how the external reality that we all know can be so manipulated that people don't know which end is up. I know, and I just was steadfast. I mean, the lessons learned. The reader may come up with different lessons, but the lesson I took away: never give up and never give in.
So politics takes a lot of patience, right? So you did state politics and then ultimately you went to Congress. How did you have the patience to deal with, uphill battles constantly? It seems like every day in politics is compromise, agreement. It's not an easy profession.
Well, life is very creative. I mean, I take a very creative approach to every day. I don't spend my time worrying about what might happen. I spend my time trying to make things happen. And so, whether it was the state senate or the U.S. House, I look at the things creatively, and I believe in getting involved. I'm not somebody that sits back and watches. I'm a participant. And on the floor of the House, there's a dynamic there. It's like a big high school in some ways, but there's a dynamic, almost a physical emotion, the movement of physical forces that you can feel when you're down there when there's an issue at stake. And to be involved, to talk to the people who are making the decisions as you are, you find that there are times when you can insert yourself into a debate and change the outcome. That's what makes it so exciting. That's why I love being on the floor of the House, because that's where things can happen. And so I never got frustrated. I never felt impatient for anything. I was just grateful to have a chance to represent the people and have a chance to enter into the decision making and the debates, and to occasionally have an opportunity to try to change the outcome. I mean, it's such a blessing to have that. And so I felt very blessed to be there, particularly since, when I left City Hall in Cleveland, I no one would take bets that I'd have a career again.
So, did you have Republican friends? Did you work with people across the
Oh yeah,
aisle?
yeah.
What was that like?
I don't really, you know, parties don't describe who we are as Americans. So I made it a point to reach across the aisle all the time. I'd like to point to this giant American eagle that spreads its wings across the canopy of the house, and to point up to it and say, you see that eagle needs two wings to fly. None of us in politics are able to impose our will on anyone else. It's always a collaborative effect or effort. And it's unwise to disparage anyone because of their political party, their philosophy. Try to get to know them, try to work with them, see if you can work with them on one issue. You may disagree on 99, but the one issue you agree on could be the most important issue for the country. So always keep open the door to work with people, and that's what I've done. So I've worked with Republicans, Democrats. To me, you might have a disagreement, but that disagreement can enable you to explore a relationship. You might end up being friends and find something else to agree on, but never, never, never cut off communication or cut off access to decision makers simply because you're not happy with the way a particular issue turned out. I mean, life is this incredible pageant. There's so many opportunities out there every day that if you could find something to agree with people on, or with you, hey, you might really be able to make a contribution and change things. So I always look for those opportunities, and you know, if I was impatient, it was only to get started at a given day and get into it, get into the action.
So eventually your congressional district that you represented for so many years was redistricted. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was a little bit of a Gandhi dance as far as between the Democrats and Republicans, because at first the Republicans were going to chop up the district, but then they decided not to because I was one of the few Democrats who was willing to talk to them, even though I didn't vote with them. So it looked like I had a district. And then the Democrats weighed in and they said, nah, Kucinich has to go. He's not down the line with us all the time. And so eventually my seat was chopped up, but not at the behest of the Republicans, at the behest of the Democrats. And, politics can be very strange that way. You just presume, well, Democrats would want to protect a longstanding Democratic seat. Not a chance. Political parties have their own agenda. They represent interests that I may or may not have gone along with. That's okay. I never complained about it. But the one thing people need to know, it was not the Republicans who caused my congressional seat to be eliminated. It was the Democratic Party out of Columbus, Ohio.
Wow. So do you think you were too far left for them, or just off the political spectrum, or not pushing their agenda sufficiently to their liking?
I can't be controlled. I'm not transactional. If something's right, I'll go along with it. If it's not, I won't. I mean, that's pretty simple. But there are types who feel that, well, whatever the party, quote unquote, wants, you got to do it.
But is
So
is the party really have a good thumb on the pulse of America? We saw that
um,
Hillary Clinton lost in 2016, and what ensued afterwards. Does
well,
the
sometimes
party
it's,
really understand?
well, it can, but when it doesn't, it's generally because, you know, I don't know, 30 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, the Democratic Party started to take contributions from the same corporate interests as Republicans. So the difference between the two parties became blurred. That doesn't mean that people inside the party were blurring their differences, but the differences did become blurred, and that would affect party policy. Healthcare, for example. I mean, the insurance companies have their hooks into both political parties. This is the reason why you don't have Medicare for all. I mean, it just happens that way. So uh, the system needs a lot of help, and I think it probably needs another party as well. But it's often when you're inside, all you have is your integrity. you, I'm not holier than thou. I'm not better than anyone else. But if I see something I don't agree with because I think it's fundamentally wrong, nothing anybody can tell me about what they're going to do to me, for me, or whatever is going to change my mind. On the other hand, if I agree with something, I'll work with anyone to make it accomplished. So, I guess my approach is somewhat pragmatic, but it's a kind of pragmatism born of idealism.
About your presidential run, because I remember that. I remember seeing you on TV, and you were one of the. You were seeing in my notes here, and I had forgotten this. You were the last to concede to John Kerry. Tell me about that.
Yeah, look. I was in that race from February of 2003, I think it was, all the way through to the convention in Boston. And my purpose was to make sure that the people knew they had a choice all the way through, and they did. And so, I was able to run. I ran a lot stronger in some of the later primaries, and I was very happy to stay in the race. In the end, I supported the nominee. That's part of the deal when you get into that kind of a setting. In a way, you're honor bound to go with
So
the
tell me
winner.
a little bit about also. So you said you stayed in the race in order to talk about certain issues, and that after your congressional career brought you to Fox News, an unlikely platform for you, Congressman, isn't it?
Not at all. I mean, it's actually how to change people's minds if you don't talk to them. Fox News is a very powerful news outlet. And I had a chance to be able to communicate with people without changing my opinion on anything. Fox News didn't hire me so they could get me to spout some kind of a Fox party line. That never happened. They wanted to know what my opinion was. I mean, when I was called by Roger Ailes to consider going to work for Fox, he said, Dennis, I don't agree with much of anything that you say, but I think you're honest, and I think that your point of view would be valuable on our network. And so I was never, ever, in hundreds of appearances, ever asked to take a particular point of view or line, even suggested. And what I found out was that it really set the stage for a deeper understanding that you can communicate with people, even though you may have strong differences of opinion. And you can have friendships with people, even though you may differ as far as one important issue or another.
In fact, you came out and praised Trump's inauguration speech. Can you tell me why? And for those of us who are confused, can you clear that up?
Well, I think first of all, I think that being a good American involves that no matter who wins the election, you give that person at least a day. I mean, really, it's like it didn't need to pile on day one. He said some things about American trade that I've been saying for 40 years. I thought it was good. Um, no one would confuse my politics with Donald Trump's, who knew anything about me. But I also feel that, it was the beginning of a new term, and you want to communicate to all Americans that as Americans, the election's over, we close ranks and move the country ahead. Um, that's on day one. On day two, you can go back to fighting. But right after an inauguration, I mean, it's like, I think I think as an American, I think all of us as Americans need to uh, consider that day, which is a celebration of who we are as a country. It's a celebration of process. We may not like the person who gets elected. I can tell you, I've watched many inaugurations and looked at someone raising their right hand, and I didn't vote for that person. But you close ranks as a country for a day where you celebrate America, not one person. And you try to indicate an interest in giving somebody a break and working with them. Um, and, I don't know many times that he would have had my vote, but I will tell you that I think that we have to respect the presidency on the inauguration day.
So, Congressman, if I give you a magic wand, this podcast is called Follow the Profit. If you could reinvent the American economy, what would you do? Line by line.
Um, Stop spending money on wars. We have blown trillions of dollars on wars that were based on lies. There's no other way to put it. We're not going to rule the world. We can't afford to rule the world. We have enough problems figuring out how we're going to run our country rather than telling somebody else how they should run theirs. I would caution about this aggressive militarism, which has marked America's foreign policy in the last 20 years. I mean, Biden seems to be dialing that back, as did Trump in some ways. And I would, you suddenly have trillions of dollars that you make available for other priorities, such as rebuilding the infrastructure. Congress is doing that right now. Hopefully, we have over $3-4 trillion in needs to rebuild America: roads, bridges, water system, sewer system. It's an investment in our country. You put people back to work with good paying jobs. That's what you need. You need good paying jobs. I change all these trade agreements. I mean, America was a sucker of the world on trade. You know, whether it was NAFTA, GATT, the China trade, I voted against every one that I could.
How did because
You cannot give
because
away your
Congressman,
money.
I grew up in an era where free trade was kind of, a decided issue. Why were you always suspicious of it?
Because it didn't have any requirements for workers' rights, for wages, for human rights, prohibitions on slave labor, for environmental quality principles. I mean, we have these principles of sorts in our country, but when we go to China or other countries and they don't have any workers' rights, any human rights, any environmental quality principles, what happens? We're actually subsidizing a degradation of the environment, a degradation of humanity, a diminishment of workers' rights. And we're undermining those rights here at home. I saw that so clearly. And so, whether it was in Seattle in 1999 when the Teamsters were marching with the Turtles, and I had 118 members of Congress sign a petition demanding that any trade agreement that came out of Seattle, mandatory workers' rights, human rights, environmental quality principles. Trade's great, but you got to have a level playing field. America's never done that. Look, when China trade came up, there were 5 lobbyists for every member of Congress. We spent over 2,000 lobbyists, right? And leading American corporations were coming to my office. Boeing came into my office and they asked me to vote for China trade. And what I had discovered before the meeting is they were going to give China the prototype on the development of the latest aircraft. Aircraft manufacturing, huge American industry. Why the hell would we give that away to anybody? So I really look at what's best for America. Not, worry about the rest of the world later. Take care of America. We haven't done that.
Well, we've hollowed out our middle class no matter what you think about free trade. Do you feel like free trade has really played a role in
Oh,
kind of,
absolutely.
places like Ohio have been hollowed out industrially?
100%. Draw a straight line from those trade agreements to the closing down of small factories and dialing back of big industries. Main Street stores start to go down because people don't have the income they once had. They lose their jobs. They have to relocate to other areas. Their quality of life has been diminished. Yeah, the middle class standing of Americans started to erode about 50 years ago. And, trade's been part of it. And our spending on military has been part of it. Our, the drugs that came into this country as a result of our involvement in Southeast Asia, the drugs that came into this country as a result of our involvement in Afghanistan. Our country's been under assault and bad decisions have been made. I love America, but, our policies, foreign policies, domestic policies, continue to leave something to be desired. So I stay involved.
So how do you begin? So it seems like, dialing back the military industrial complex is pretty straightforward, right? No matter what you think, right? And we're all pro military, pro veterans, but that's a pretty easy issue. This free trade issue is a lot more dicey because, speaking to you today on a bunch of imported equipment, we have a situation where China is an ascending power, with all our stuff that we buy, they use that money for their global ambitions. How do you even begin to undo the last 20 years
We have
of
to
just
rebuild our
established free
strategic.
trade?
We have to rebuild our strategic industrial base. If we're going to rebuild our infrastructure, we ought to be using American steel. You have steel, automotive, aerospace, shipping. Those are industries that help build America. They help sustain us through world wars. They help build the middle class. We've let a lot of it erode. We need to go back to that. There's not, it's like give me that old time religion. We need to go back to making things with our hands. Buy American, or buy American. All the cheap goods that we buy, people are making next to nothing making them, right? And we're not buying things that are made in America, that where people get a decent wage and some benefits. Got to start thinking about that. I mean, we have this, multi-trillion-dollar economy, and we act like, these corporate interests really have sold out America. I mean, that's the way I look at it, by shipping our jobs out of the country. I come from Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland, Ohio was part of the, industrial power that built America, that sustained it. And I see what happened in Cleveland. I see these trade agreements have eroded it, and we still have to face some of the issues that I've raised. They're still existed.
This sounds like a lot of the stuff that the Trump administration tried to pursue. Do you feel like they were on the right track with the tariffs with China and whatnot?
Let me tell you something. The dollar bill has an ideology all of its own. People are moving industries out of the United States, and they continue to do so. I want things made in America. I want to make sure our markets are not going to be destroyed by chips that come in, the microprocessing and the high level chips that are created in Silicon Valley. Look, that industry can be wiped out in a day with a flood of imports. We have to realize that America is a great place of innovation and science and technology. We've made things that we can be proud of, but we can't keep an edge if we give away what it is we've made. And this is where corporations have a patriotic responsibility to America. They don't really feel it. They don't pretend they have it. But I think they really do. If you're going to take your money out of the country, keep it out of the country, make cheap goods, flood this country with it, you're not a good American.
I guess what do we do about rising prices though? I guess that's always the big question, right? Which is the opposite of this. Like I'm able to get this microphone that I'm speaking to you on today for a low cost because it was likely manufactured abroad. So do we just eat it as consumers, especially in an era where, 40 to 50% of Americans get by paycheck to paycheck?
Well, the rising prices go up even though the labor's cheap. Keep that in mind. It's not the cost of labor that's causing prices to go up. It's the demand and the go Wall Street financialization of the economy. I mean, if people have high wages, they don't mind buying goods that cost more if they're made in this country. But the goods cost more when they're not made in this country. Think about how that accelerates the erosion of our economy and of economic opportunities. So yeah, I have probably a slightly different view of that. And I'm not happy with the Democratic Party. You got to remember, NAFTA passed under President Clinton. I think it was dead wrong with it. And it was one of the reasons why the knock-on effect, I think, was actually felt by Hillary Clinton in her attempt to be elected president. I think that's a real reason why she was knocked out, because if you look at Ohio, at Michigan, and states in the Midwest that took a beating when these trade agreements passed. There was going to be a reckoning that would occur politically, just inevitable.
So, speaking of that, populist politics, you seem like you fashioned yourself as a populist politician. Is there room for that in today's world? Obviously, we saw the rise of
I,
Trump, and we'll probably see
I,
more populist presidents.
I don't fashion myself. I'm a truth teller. I just call it as I see it. I don't care whatever label people put on me. That doesn't mean anything to me. But when I see something that I not just disagree with, but I know it's wrong, I speak out. That's what I did after 9/11 when our country began to go on the path towards war against Iraq. I did the analysis. Anyone who wants to go and I'll demonstrate to them right now how that's the path that I've taken of truth telling. Go to any search engine, type in Kucinich Iraq War Analysis, October 2nd, 2002. And you will be surprised to learn that a member of Congress, me, had it nailed back then that they didn't have proof that Iraq had anything to do with 9/11, with Al Qaeda's role in 9/11. Iraq didn't have the intention, the capability of attacking America. Iraq did not have the weapons of mass destruction, which the administration at the time were using as the pretext to accelerate a military attack on Iraq. This was not just a tragedy. This was a monstrous lie that still calls out for justice. The people who went there to serve this country served honorably, and we love them. But the people who sent them there, not honorable. They lied. And, we still have to reckon with that the Iraq war was based on a total lie. And I knew that before we got into it. I organized 125 people, mostly Democrats, to vote against the Iraq war resolution. That's the way I am. If I see something, I'll say it. And no issue's too big that'll cause me to say, oh, well, I can't handle that. It's a war. No, there are things you have to step forward on, and that's what I did. Just like I did years earlier in Cleveland when I was called upon to say the sale of a municipal electric system was wrong, that they were trying to force us to sell it. It's fundamentally wrong. So it's just about, the capacity, the willingness to stand up for what's right and and to challenge what's wrong.
So, are there any truth tellers out there that we see on television these days in politics?
I don't look for truth tellers. I follow my own conscience.
Well, is there anyone that we should be watching?
No, I'm not going to advise you to do that. I think that, each person has to decide for himself or herself based on their own moral compass what's right and wrong. I'm not a devotee of anybody's politics, of anybody's career. I have a spiritual center, and that's what I follow. And I make my decisions based on my, not just my life experience, but on some deeper understanding of whether things are right or wrong.
Well, I hope there's more of that in politics. On that note, we know your time is valuable, Congressman. Thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, I appreciate this incisive, probing interview because it really, it causes me to go deeper into these questions, and I just want to thank you for that.
Yeah, of course. That's my job. That's what journalism is supposed to be all about. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And please let people know about the book. If you can, put it on a website so people have a chance to look at it. It's nothing like what that book described has ever before happened in American politics. At least it never surfaced before. So thanks so much.
Thank you. I'm David Grasso, and you're listening to Follow the Prophet. So today's guest is someone that I've been following for a very long time. I'm older, and I've been following politics since I was a teenager in high school in Orlando, Florida. And someone that was always on my radar was Dennis Kucinich. He's a congressman from Ohio. He ran for president a few times, and he has a lot of interesting, unconventional opinions on politics. And he joins me here today. Okay, that's a whole lot clearer. So one of the things that I've always liked about Congressman Kucinich is that he challenges my ideas that I have about America. I can't think of many things I agree with him on, but I think it's unique insight that we have to think about. You know, all these questions about free trade and the role of the military are important questions for our generation. We can't let these go anymore. We're seeing a serious crisis with the middle class in this country and their ability to just pay for their basic needs, including rent, healthcare, and education. And a lot of it is a function of how much money they make. They're not making enough money. So how do we get more money into the pockets of the middle class? And naturally, all roads lead back to trade, specifically free trade. Me, myself, I'm very pro free trade. I feel like it's the cloud above your head. You can't really fight it. But there are questions as to whether we've taken it too far, whether we do need some homegrown manufacturing. And it's the same thing with the military. Having a strong military and being the global leader is very important. But fighting needless wars in nation building is probably something that we shouldn't be doing. And that's a bipartisan issue these days. But in the not so distant past, when I was in college, the Iraq War was something that was very popular. And today we probably wouldn't see the same thing because of economic reasons. It's widely apparent that here in America, regular Americans need help. We need secure power, paved roads, infrastructure in general, a stronger education system. Our needs grow every day. Everything gets more competitive over time. And if we don't make investments here at home and grow the economy of the future and really visualize what we want to be as a country, we'll never get there. And I think that a lot of that process involves talking to people on the other side and realizing that truth isn't left or right. It's often in the middle. On that note, I'm David Grosso for Follow the Prophet. We'll see you next time.